Thank you, everyone, for joining me for this Levy Library Education and Research Services Spring 2021 workshop series session on review types, selecting the right review methodology for your research question. My name is Carrie Levinson. I am the reference and instruction librarian for the Mount Sinai West and Morningside campuses. And here is our agenda for the next hour or so. So it looks like a short agenda, but we're actually covering quite a lot. If you have any questions, then there are going to be some pauses between each section. So feel free to ask during those. You can unmute yourselves or type into the chat box. And there's also going to be a question and answer session at the very end. So first, I am going to spend some time talking about some popular review types. So there are many, many different types of reviews, and we would pretty much never finish if we went into all of them, but we're going to go into some of the more popular ones. And then I'll talk a little bit about how you can determine which review type is best for your question after you have really heard the definitions of a few of the more used ones. And then, of course, we will end by talking about how you can get some more in-depth help from one of our librarians. I want to start off with a poll. So I'm going to launch that right now. This is an anonymous poll, so I am not judging you on what you pick. I'm just curious as to which review type, if you are interested in a particular review type, you are very interested in learning about. So I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Okay. So thank you very much for doing that. It looks like we have a variety. So many of you want to learn about systematic reviews and all of the reviews, and a couple of you also want to learn more about scoping and literature reviews. So all of them, once again, way too many to go over, although I will be going over some other types besides the ones that I talk about more in depth. But we are definitely talking about systematic literature and scoping reviews as well. So that's great. Thank you very much. And let's get right into these popular review types. So the first one, everyone has probably heard of these. You've probably written one at some point in your academic career. These are literature or narrative reviews. And either one, literature or narrative review, it means exactly the same thing. So I might go back and forth between referring to a literature review or a narrative review, but I'm referring to exactly the same thing. These are reviews that convey all the relevant information on a given topic. They describe many different types of material types. So they can look at journal articles, they can look at books, they can look at ebooks, they can look at guidelines, they can look at conference papers, they can look at other literature reviews. Lots of different research material, as long as it's relevant to that given topic. They're useful for a variety of things because they are very flexible. So you can look at one to provide an overview of the main theories and hypotheses, appropriate methods and methodologies, and key findings for a particular topic. You can see who the biggies are for that particular topic, who the key authors and researchers are. And it can be useful for identifying knowledge gaps within a field or a topic. If there is a certain subset that just hasn't had a whole lot of research done on it, you can see that through a literature review. May also make recommendations for future study if there are indeed gaps, or if there is just something that maybe needs to be expanded upon. And they can also be standalone or part of another work. So you can have a literature review, and once again, I'm sure you've seen these, that are entire papers unto themselves, or they might just be the introduction to an empirical study. So you have to give the background information for why you decided to create this experiment or write the survey or something like that. And that is also a literature review. It's just a much more succinct. The methodology for a literature review is pretty varied. So there are several ways you can conduct a literature review. There isn't one way that is prescribed, but no matter what you do, you have to define the scope of your research. So you have to step back for a minute and figure out what exactly you want to look at, because literature reviews can be very, very broad. And presumably you would like to eventually stop searching the literature and write your literature review and then be done with it. And you can't do that if your topic is so broad that you can just search for everything. So you do have to have a slightly narrow scope, just so you can pick some relevant literature from different databases. So once you do that, you will then search the literature once you have your scope. And you may have to do this for a while. You may go back and forth a little bit, because maybe you started off with a topic that you think is interesting, but you don't know a whole lot about it. And then you discover things that you never knew, and you get really interested in them. So you say, oh no, I want to actually go back and search a little bit more about this particular aspect of my topic and focus a little bit more on that. So you may have to do your searches. You may have to redo your searches a few times, and that's not abnormal. Literature reviews are an iterative process. But once you have done that, you then want to organize your relevant findings in a way that makes sense to you. So perhaps into themes or key points. Once again, this type of review is very flexible. You do always want to make sure that you keep track of your sources, however, because you can be going back and forth a lot. So if you do not have a reference manager, such as EndNote or Zotero or Mendeley, I recommend getting one of those, particularly for something like a literature review, which can have a lot of citations. It will make your life easier in the end. And then, of course, you're going to draft your manuscript. And I'm not going to get too much into this. We do actually have another session that is called Conducting a Literature Review that really goes into the methodology more in depth. And because we have many other review types to get through, I'm just going to give you this basic overview. There are limitations to literature reviews. So as I have mentioned a couple of times here, there's no systematized methodology. So there are a lot of different ways you can conduct it. And that can cause some issues. For one, it can introduce bias. So if you have just one person working on a literature review, which is totally fine, you can be one person or you can have a team. You don't know the agenda of that author. So you don't know if they're selectively choosing certain articles to promote a particular motivation. They may not be. They may be doing it unintentionally, but you don't know. There's a potentially huge body of literature to go through. Once again, this is why you have to sort of narrow in your topic at least a little bit. We're not saying that you have to have a really narrow topic. That's not necessary, but it does have to have a focus. And this is, of course, something that librarians can help you out with, sort of focusing where you might be going. And you may have to go back and forth several times. So you may have to devote more time than you thought you would as you learn more about your topic. Because the search strategy for literature reviews is not required to be reported, it often isn't. So if you're reading a literature review, you may not know exactly what search strategy that author or authors used. So if you want to replicate that particular paper, you may not be able to because you don't know exactly what they searched. So that's another way that literature reviews sort of have a limitation in that way. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to our next type? Okay, so moving on to systematic reviews, which I know a few of you definitely wanted to hear about. So unlike literature reviews or narrative reviews, which can be extremely broad in focus, systematic reviews are very narrow. They are studies of studies, primary studies in general, usually randomized controlled trials, not always. They seek to answer a specific question. So you cannot just have a broad topic for a systematic review. That's not what they're for. They are intended to answer a specific question, usually on an intervention, usually looking at randomized controlled trials. They aim to identify and synthesize all the relevant literature on that question. So unlike a literature review, which can be a little bit selective in the end result of what articles or research material is synthesized, you are trying to get everything in a systematic review that there possibly could be. So this is searching databases, and it's also searching gray literature, unpublished literature, like working papers, like conference papers, a lot of different things. Systematic reviews are useful for confirming current practices, for guiding decision-making and interventions, and for informing future research. As I mentioned, they include published literature and gray literature. They often look at interventions or treatments, although not always. So you don't, it's not mandatory to be looking at an intervention or treatment, but that's usually what systematic reviews are looking at, and to look at things in a very specific way. So systematic reviews follow a very rigorous set of methods that I'm going to get into. And they also, the reason really that they follow this rigorous set of methods is because they want to eliminate bias and subjectivity. So for systematic reviews, we really recommend that you work with a team. So because I mentioned literature reviews, if there's one person that can kind of either intentionally or unintentionally introduce bias, having a team will help to reduce that risk of bias, because you have more people selecting things in a more objective manner. And systematic reviews also require a quality appraisal. So this is a risk of bias assessment that is done in the later stages of a review. And actually, before I go into the methodology, I do want to mention meta-analyses. So you may have heard of a meta-analysis and thought that it was the same thing as a systematic review, and that is not quite the case. So meta-analyses are often part of systematic reviews. You can have a meta-analysis without a systematic review. It's not done very often, but it is possible to do. But usually, if you see a meta-analysis, it's part of a systematic review. There is nothing wrong with having a systematic review that doesn't have a meta-analysis. I just want to point that out right away. Meta-analyses use statistics to pool the data from the studies that were found during the systematic review process, which means that these studies have to be similar enough that you can actually do a statistical analysis on them. And that's why you will see systematic reviews that don't have meta-analyses, because they might be looking at studies that are dissimilar. And so you just can't have a statistical analysis on things that are completely dissimilar. What do I mean by similar enough? These are things like studies that are measuring the same outcome in the same way, or that the ways of measuring outcomes have to be similar enough for meaningful comparison. There are other ways, but those are some of the bigger ones. I just want to point this out. So this is a forest plot, and this is something you see often with a meta-analysis. And these stand for studies. So these lines and dots here stand for studies. And you can see that they line up pretty well. Not totally completely well, but they line up pretty well. And that's because the studies are homogeneous enough for this team to have done a statistical analysis on them. So that's basically the big thing about a meta-analysis. But for the purposes of this session, when I talk about a systematic review and the methodology and the limitations, you can sort of stick on and meta-analyses at the end. So here is, once again, the general overview of the methodology. Once again, we have another session that is specifically focused on systematic reviews, which goes a little bit more in depth, but I will give you the general overview of this. And you can see this is a lot longer than the literature review methodology because these are steps that you have to do. So no matter what kind of review you're looking at, you have to define your question or topic. Often with a systematic review, you are using the PICO clinical question model. A lot of you are probably familiar with that. If you are not, I will just say P stands for the patient or population that you're looking at. I stands for the intervention or exposure that you are looking at or comparing. C is the comparison if you are in fact comparing two interventions. And O is the outcome or outcomes that you either hope to see or do see. So you often use PICO to define a very focused question. So once again, you have to have a focused question for a systematic review. You cannot have a broad question. So first you do that. Once again, several steps here are ones that librarians can help you out with. Particularly conducting preliminary searching. So this is an important step, and there are a couple of reasons for it. So the first one is to ensure that there haven't been systematic reviews or meta-analyses on your topic, on your question, published within the last couple of years. And the reason that you want to check for that is because, one, there's generally not going to be any new literature or a lot of new literature on your question to be able to be synthesized. And journal editors will also be looking to see if there have been recent systematic reviews, and they might say to you, what makes yours different? And if yours is the exact same thing, then you don't have a great response to that question. So you might be better served by either reframing your question or going to a different question. The second reason for conducting preliminary searching is to make sure that there's actually literature on your topic. So you can have a really great question, but if no one has published any primary studies on it, you can't synthesize them. There's just, you can't do anything with them. If there's only one, you can't do a systematic review on that. So there needs to be a sufficient amount of literature that you can actually put through the systematic review process. So those two things are important to check for. And you also, if you do in fact determine that there is enough, that there seems to be enough literature on your topic, if you really have your heart set on a meta-analysis, you can see if those studies appear to be homogeneous enough to do a meta-analysis on. So let's say you have determined there is enough literature on your topic and that no one has published a similar systematic review in the last couple of years. So the next step is drafting a protocol. And a protocol is really a roadmap for what you are going to be doing in your systematic review. So it's going to go through things like the databases you're going to be searching, how you're going to do some non-database searching because you want to try to get all the relevant literature you can, how you're going to be synthesizing data, how you're going to be, what tools risk of bias tool or tools you're going to be using to do your quality appraisal. All these different steps. Then you are going to register your protocol in a registry such as Prospero, which is basically made for that. You can search Prospero also to see if there are other similar systematic reviews in process, and you can determine whether you'd like to continue with them with your own after seeing that. So registering your protocol helps you to claim your topic. So if there aren't any similar ones, you put your protocol in a registry, and other people can search for it and say, hey, there's already a team working on this. Let's do something else, because they're going to get published before us. It also prevents post hoc efforts to show positive results, because you're showing everyone what you're going to be doing. So you can't really do tests later, and I'm not saying that anyone is going to do this, but people can't do tests later and say, hey, there are positive results here, when there actually aren't any. So because you have that whole methodology written out. This is also where you're going to really set your eligibility criteria, which is a very important part of the study selection process. So you have to figure out what kinds of studies are going to be in your systematic review, and that's what the eligibility criteria do. So these are things like saying, okay, we're only going to look at studies that looked at patients that are 64 years or younger. So if we see an article that looked at a bunch of 80-year-olds, that's being excluded because they're they don't fit our inclusion criteria. Or if you're looking at a mindfulness intervention, you have to define what a mindfulness intervention is. So let's say you define them as breathing exercises, meditation, or awareness exercises, and that's it. If you get results that are on yoga, because they're not within your inclusion criteria, you're going to exclude them from your systematic review. So it's very important that you figure this out early, because you want to have this set by the time you are doing your comprehensive search. Once again, this is a part where the library can really help you out. You're going to design and execute a comprehensive search, which is going to be more complex than your preliminary searching. We generally recommend that you look in a minimum of 3 databases, in addition to doing some non-database searching. So there are a variety of ways to do that, such as looking at gray literature, looking at the references of relevant articles that you found, or actually doing something called hand searching, which is physically looking at entire journal issues and seeing if there's anything you missed. So there are a variety of ways of doing that, but you are expected to do at least one of those. So a comprehensive search is an exhaustive search. It may result in thousands and thousands of articles. That's not unusual. And this is part of what takes a long time in a systematic review, because then you're going to be going into your screening process, your study selection stage. And this is split into 2 stages. So the first one is title abstract screening. So you're, as it sounds like, you're going to be looking at the titles and abstracts of the articles that have come up in your comprehensive search. And you are going to think about your eligibility criteria and include or exclude those articles based on that criteria. If they seem to fit your inclusion criteria, they will move on to the next stage of the study selection process, which is full text screening, which means, once again, as it sounds, you're going to read the full text of those articles and determine whether they fit your eligibility criteria. And if they do, then they go to the quality appraisal stage, which is where you're going to pull out your risk of bias tool and determine basically how strong the evidence is in the studies that you have left. Then you're going to go through your data extraction process. So that's basically getting a spreadsheet and recording data points. Then you're going to synthesize that data in whatever way is appropriate for the type of systematic review you have done. So if you're doing a meta-analysis, that's going to end up with a statistical portion. If you're not, then it might be tables and a narrative commentary. And then you will put this all together once again in your manuscript. Even though this is a lot more involved than a literature review, there are still limitations to the systematic review type. So the synthesis here is only as reliable as the primary studies you're analyzing. So if you end up with a whole lot of low quality primary studies, the conclusion that you reach might not be as definitive. If you decide to try to stick a square peg into a round hole and pool a bunch of heterogeneous studies, so really dissimilar studies in a meta-analysis, it can lead to a false sense of precision around the truth because you are not really comparing the same things together in a statistical analysis. So it wouldn't be as precise a conclusion as if you were looking at a bunch of similar studies. And this is just something to know about in general. Just because something is labeled a systematic review doesn't mean that it was conducted with the appropriate rigor. So you should always look at the methodology of the systematic reviews that you are reading, just to make sure that they did indeed follow these steps that I've just outlined. And of course, it only answers that specific question. So systematic reviews are not made for generalizations. They're answering that specific question. They're not answering even really, really related questions. They're just looking at that question. So you can't make big assumptions on them for a general topic. So does anyone have any questions before I move on to scoping reviews? Okay. Oh, I am sorry, we're not quite moving on to scoping reviews yet. So you may be wondering, how do I figure out how to do all of these different steps? There is a set of guidelines called Prisma. And Prisma includes some handy dandy checklists and flow diagrams. You've probably seen the flow diagram in systematic reviews. So this is the checklist. And at first it looks a little daunting. I know it's very, very hard to read. I wanted to include the entire thing so you could see the entirety of it. And this is something that's often mandatory for submitting your systematic review manuscript to a journal. They often want this to be included as well. And these are reporting items for a systematic review. And at first, this looks really daunting. It might scare you a little bit, but I assure you it's not as bad as it looks. I'm going to read you the first checklist item, which is identify the report as a systematic review. You would be doing that anyway. So all you have to do is check off the location in your manuscript where the item is reported, where you're saying this is a systematic review. So, and it goes on to generally do the same thing for the different sections of your systematic review. So you can actually see this as something that is very helpful to make sure that you're including all the elements of a systematic review you should be including. You should also do this not at the very end, but as you are going through your systematic review. And I mentioned flow diagram. This is the Prisma 2020 flow diagram. They have recently updated their both the checklist and the diagram. So this basically says, where are the studies that you search for? Where are they from? How did you screen them? And how many did you end up with? And why did you exclude the ones that you read the full text of? So once again, often required by journals. Okay, so now we are going to move on to scoping reviews, which follow a lot of the systematic review methodology in certain ways, but are not systematic reviews because they have different aims. So scoping reviews are a preliminary assessment of the potential size and scope of the research literature on a topic. So you can already see this is a lot broader than a systematic review is. It's not trying to answer a question. It is trying to see what is out there on a topic. So these are useful for examining a body of literature that hasn't been reviewed so far or hasn't been comprehensively reviewed thus far, for identifying or clarifying key concepts or definitions for a topic that maybe are pretty vague and people don't really understand what they are, and also seeing how research is conducted on a topic. So what are the study designs that are used when people are looking at this topic? Unlike systematic reviews, which often, once again, only look at randomized controlled trials, scoping reviews can look at many different study designs and methods. They often include ongoing research, and a quality assessment is not required. Depending on what you're looking at, it can actually be kind of hard to do risk bias assessment on the studies in a scoping review. So sometimes it's recommended if you can do it, but it's not mandatory. Scoping reviews also have another purpose. So they can be standalone. You can in fact publish a scoping review as a scoping review, or you can use it to see what literature is out there if you have the aim of conducting a systematic review eventually on that topic and formulating a question. So you can see here, methodology, pretty similar to a systematic review in a lot of ways. So you're still defining your question or topic, but it is broader in scope. You always still want to do a little bit of preliminary searching to see what's out there. You can do a protocol. It's recommended to do a protocol, but you're not going to register it in Prospero because Prospero does not accept protocols of scoping reviews. It only accepts systematic review protocols. So there are other registries, such as the Open Science Foundation, that you can use to register a scoping review protocol. And you can see these are all pretty similar to what I just went over with the systematic review. The quality appraisal is optional depending on what you're looking at. Data extraction is called charting because you're looking at a chart basically. In a scoping review, your synthesis is generally going to be theme tables and charts because you will look at the themes that come out of your scoping review. You draft the manuscript, and afterwards, there is an optional step that's called a consultation exercise. And this is where stakeholders outside the study review team, so for a scoping review, once again, you generally want a team. You don't want to do scoping review by yourself, are invited to provide their insight to inform and validate the findings from a scoping review. So these are people like representatives from organizations on that topic. Maybe it's a condition or an intervention or something like that. Health professionals who are working with those programs that you're looking at or those interventions, and they can provide a slightly different perspective. And maybe they know about articles or other research material that you may not have heard of. So once again, this is an optional exercise, but it can often be valuable. So scoping reviews also have limitations. They don't generally formally evaluate the quality of evidence because that's not what they're designed to do. They're designed to just give you an assessment on the nature and scope of a certain body of literature. Because they often gather a whole bunch of information from a huge variety of places, you need a large study team to screen the large number of results that you're going to get. Unlike a systematic review, so you have, with a systematic review, you have your one big search that you're doing in several databases, and that's it. You're not going back and forth. So that's very unlike a literature review. It's also unlike a scoping review, which may require multiple structured searches to look at different themes. I should, and I'll emphasize this again. So with a systematic review, you're doing one search and then you're going on with it. You're not going back and forth. So that's one big thing that is a big difference between literature reviews and often scoping reviews, because you might need to do a bunch of searches for a scoping review. And once again, they don't provide a synthesized result or an answer to a specific question because they're not designed to do that. They provide an overview of that particular body of literature that you're looking at. Prisma has an extension checklist for scoping reviews. You can see it's not quite as long as the one for systematic reviews, but it's a good idea, once again, to do to make sure you're including all the elements that you should be including. And you can, this one is a little bit more flexible, so there may be certain things that are not quite right for your scoping review. But it's a good guideline to include all the elements that will help you in getting published. Does anyone have any questions on scoping reviews? You can see that I am moving on to integrative reviews. Okay, so integrative reviews. This one is a little bit more esoteric than the other review types that I have mentioned, but it is increasing in popularity, and that's why I am talking about it. So integrative reviews summarize the literature about a particular phenomenon or healthcare problem. The big thing about them is that they examine both experimental and non-experimental literature. So they're looking at theory as well. They're useful for defining complex concepts, reviewing theories of evidence, and analyzing methodological issues. And they're particularly popular in nursing research literature. So you don't have to be a nurse to conduct an integrative review, but that's usually where you're going to see them in nursing literature. They're an alternative to a systematic review or meta-analysis, which have been criticized for overemphasizing randomized controlled trials. I've mentioned randomized controlled trials a lot when talking about systematic reviews. So you can see that's usually where systematic reviews go, although they don't always have to. And evidence-based practice initiatives have traditionally viewed different types of evidence, such as qualitative or quantitative evidence, as mutually exclusive. And integrative reviews are basically saying, maybe they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We're going to look at lots of different kinds of literature. There is methodology that has been codified for integrative reviews. Although this looks a lot smaller than systematic reviews methodology, basically it follows a very similar pattern. So you're defining your question or topic, you're conducting some preliminary searching, you are doing a comprehensive search, and then evaluating the data. And that the data analysis, evaluation and analysis portions depend on the sampling frame that you're looking at. So if you're looking at a lot of theoretical literature, for example, it might be useful to use a sampling frame that's been used in historical research. And that can sort of inform the type of analysis you're going to do. Or you might need a couple of different tools if you're looking at empirical research and non-empirical research. So this can be very complex. It can get a little bit confusing. And the presentation part is the drafting, you're coming to your conclusions and drafting your manuscript. It's just for the methodology that was formed in the Journal of Advanced Nursing, they call it presentation. So you probably can see some limitations for integrative reviews when you're combining many different designs and methodologies and data from empirical and theoretical papers that can contribute to a lack of rigor, bias, or just plain inaccuracy. Although following essentially a systematic review methodology does help with that. Although there have been papers that have gone into the methodology, so you can see these stages have been written out, they're still not completely well defined for how you are synthesizing the studies that you found and coming to conclusions. So they're not completely well defined. Here is basically a table of how these review types compare to one another. Just as a quick overview, so literature reviews describe an overview or a broad question. Typically, they can look at a specific question, but often they're describing an overview. Systematic reviews are always focused on a specific question, typically on an intervention. Scoping reviews assess the size and scope of the literature. And integrative reviews are focused on a practice or policy problem, usually within nursing. There are protocols for systematic reviews and scoping reviews. I believe you can do one for an integrative review if you want to, but it's not required, and literature reviews also don't require them. Basically, these three have very comprehensive searches. There's no specific search methodology for literature reviews because you can do a lot of things. The quality appraisal, the critical appraisal, risk of bias section is mandatory for systematic reviews. It's recommended for integrative reviews. It depends for scoping reviews, and it's not required for literature reviews. You are typically going to be synthesizing what you have found out in a narrative way, and the discussion and conclusion can vary very widely in a literature review, whereas systematic reviews talk about what is known, the quality of evidence that they found, and recommendations for future research. Scoping reviews give an overview, and integrative reviews provide an understanding of the healthcare issue they were looking at. So quickly, other review types, because there are many, and there are many more than this. Rapid reviews, basically systematic reviews that are done very quickly. That's why they're called rapid reviews. They're done in less than 5 weeks. They omit stages of the systematic review, making it less rigorous, but sometimes they're important for certain things, like when we have a global pandemic and really need to know about treatments. So you may have seen an increase in rapid reviews done on COVID-19 research. If you've ever asked, can there be systematic reviews on systematic reviews? Yes, they're called umbrella reviews. Mapping reviews are very similar to scoping reviews, except they are question-based rather than topic-based. Mixed methods reviews combine qualitative and quantitative studies to address overlapping or complementary questions. And realist reviews are systematic reviews that provide explanations for why complex interventions work in the real world. So I'm going to do some other quick polls here. So I'm going to launch this poll. And here is an example of a certain type of review. If you want to tell me what you think this review is. So it's a review of the last 10 years of literature on current and novel approaches to childhood obesity. In the interest of time, I'm not going to give you that much time to fill this out, but please give me your best guess. And once again, these are all anonymous, so you are not being judged on your answer. Okay. See, we have most of everyone has voted. So most of you have said that this is a scoping review with a couple, with one person saying a narrative review. And actually, this is a narrative review. So this was published as a narrative review, but it certainly could be, when framed in a way, it could have been a scoping review. So this is where things get a little bit confusing, because depending on how you frame certain questions or certain topics, they could be appropriate for different review types. So moving on to our next one. A review on the nature of evidence regarding interventions for cancer-related fatigue. And I will give you a hint here that the key to answering this one is in the nature of evidence. Okay, so we will end the polling. The majority of you have said scoping review, which is the correct answer, because they're looking to see, this is an assessment of what is actually out there. So you can see the citation down here, and it is indeed a scoping review. But I can see why you might get systematic review, because it's looking at an intervention. And I can also understand integrative review as well. So this does get a little fuzzy at certain points. Moving on to our next one, a review comparing the clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness of cytosine compared with varenicline for smoking cessation. So I will share the results here. This is, in fact, a systematic review. It is looking at it's looking at one intervention and comparing it with another. And you can actually see the very focused question in the title. What is the clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness? So it's looking very specifically only at those two things for a particular reason, for smoking cessation. And finally, a review on conflict management styles among nursing professionals. Okay, because we're running a little short on time, I'm going to end the poll right now, but it seems like everyone has figured it out. This is an integrative review. And the nursing professionals kind of gives it away for this particular one. But you can kind of see how this can get a little bit harder to figure out than maybe you would have thought. So what is best for your particular question? There are two big things that you should take into consideration. The first one is, what are your needs? If you need to see the overall picture of something, you probably want to pick a narrative or a scoping review, depending on what you're looking at. Once again, it really depends on your particular question. If you need to look at a specific topic in depth, that could be a narrative review too. Or it can be a systematic review if you're looking at a very specific question. Narrative reviews often look at a broad overview, but they can look at a specific topic. They're just not using the methodology that a systematic review does. If you need to know about a particular intervention right this second, you probably will have to search the literature rather than writing your own. But if you really don't have a whole lot of time, you probably want to pick a rapid review. If you need to see how an intervention works or compares to another intervention, generally a systematic review. And if you need to analyze nursing healthcare problems or phenomena, generally an integrative review. The other big thing you should look at is, how much time do you have? What kind of review is most appropriate for you really depends on how much time you have and your team has to focus on that topic or question. Most of these reviews require a huge time commitment. And Also, if your topic has a lot of literature written on it, it's going to take you longer than if there are only 3 studies. So systematic reviews and related types of reviews, and by related types of reviews, I mean scoping and integrative reviews, take a long time. Generally, at least a year. And that's not something that I'm saying to scare you. They've actually done studies on this. Sometimes there are good reasons for trying to get a review out as quickly as possible. I mentioned COVID-19 research. That's a good reason to have a rapid review. But you should have a reason for why you are omitting certain steps if you decide to embark upon a rapid review. When in doubt, because you may be in doubt, considering there's some flexibility in terms of which review types are appropriate for particular questions, you should ask a librarian. That's what we're here for. And finally, I will talk very briefly about our support services. So what can we help you with? We can give you an introduction like this, or you can have a one-on-one introduction to a specific review methodology and best practices. We can help you with developing your research question. We can help you with figuring out that research protocol if it's appropriate for the type of question you are doing. As I mentioned, we can help you with the search strategy development. Because you are likely going to be searching several different databases, there's going to be some overlap with your results, and they will need to be deduplicated. So we can help you with that, which can include training on covidence, which is a really great tool that can help you with the study selection process, can help you with data extraction, and it helps you with deduplicating as well. So it's made for the systematic review process, but it can also be used for other types of reviews. We can give you guidance on selecting an appropriate quality appraisal tool, if that is appropriate for your particular review type. And we can also help you with developing a realistic timeline for your project. Generally, most of these reviews cannot be done in 2 weeks. So keep that in mind, but we can help you with a more realistic timeline. So thank you very much for joining me today. I know that we are right at the hour, but I am happy to take any questions if you have them at this point. All right, if there are no questions, then please feel free to contact us at askalibrarian.mssm.edu or email us at refdesk@mssm.edu if you would like to schedule a consultation or just ask us a question. We're happy to help you. And thank you again.